Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is a celebrated theater, television, and film director who is in large part responsible for one of the greatest Broadway shows in history, Grease. He was the director of the original Broadway production, which ran for 8 years from February 14th, 1972 to April the 13th, 1980, making it the longest running Broadway show at the time. And of course, the show inspired the blockbuster movie starring Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta, who actually appeared as Doody in one of the national tours. This year, to commemorate the show's 50th anniversary, a very special book has been released, edited by our guest, along with one of the show's producers, Ken Waissman, and Adrienne Barbeau, who was the original Rizzo and who appeared on our show last year. The book is entitled Grease, Tell Me More, Tell Me More, Stories from the Broadway Phenomenon That Started It All. It's a fascinating and entertaining collection of reminiscences and stories, memorable moments, hilarious mishaps, and sentimental anecdotes, giving us the inside scoop about the show told by the creative minds that made it happen, including stars like Barry Bostwick, John Travolta, Adrienne Barbeau, Treat Williams, Mary Lou Henner, Peter Gallagher, Adrian Zmed, and many others who appeared on stage and who worked behind the scenes. The book is a must-read, not only for fans of the show, but for every theater lover, because we get to share the collaborative experience of so many artists working on a labor of love, which became a momentous and beloved piece of music theater history. In addition to his monumental involvement in Grease, which earned him a Tony nomination for Best Director, our guest directed many other Broadway shows, including the nostalgic World War II musical Over Here, starring two of the Andrews sisters, Once in a Lifetime, the Octet Bridge Club, and Moon Over Buffalo, starring the one and only Carol Burnett. He received a second Tony nomination for Best Director for Night Mother, and he also directed the movie starring Sissy Spacek and Anne Bancroft. If that weren't enough, he's a highly respected 3-time Emmy-nominated television director who's directed many TV shows, including ER, Mad About You, LA Law, Gilmore Girls, and dozens more. I'm delighted to welcome Tom.Moore to our show. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. And thanks you very much for talking about our little book.
Tom, I must tell you that I absolutely loved your book, not only because I learned so much about Grease, but because I learned a lot about what goes into creating a Broadway show. For example, you wrote that casting is at least 70 to 90% of a director's work. Why is that?
Well, I think if you fail in casting, no matter what your concept, no matter what the script, it's not going to reach the audience, because it's the actors that take it that last step that actually give it the imprimatur of being something full and satisfying. And I think any director would tell you that at least 70% is in casting. So we spent in all those years, and we never stopped that effort. In all those years, we made heroic efforts, really, on the part of the casting directors like Vinnie Liff and Linda Otto and Jerry Windsor, in trying to make sure that we maintained the absolute best of each character we could find.
You auditioned 2,000 actors to find 16 cast members, and it took almost a month. Unlike what happens in casting most musicals, you were primarily looking for people who could act first, then sing, then dance. Many cast members wrote that the auditions for Grease were among the most grueling auditions of their entire careers. Why were the auditions so difficult?
Well, perhaps because both Pat Birch and I, the choreographer, was so young and the producer was so young. And so we were determined that we would have the very best of the best. And lots of actors, don't get me wrong, we saw incredibly talented people, but they just weren't absolutely those characters are right for those particular things. And that's why it took so long, because one of the things that I think makes Grease so eternally and universally successful is because of people identifying with these characters. And so these characters, these iconic characters, which Jim and Warren wrote, had to be perfect. I mean, I leap here a little bit, but there's a reason that people in Japan, for instance, say when they saw the show and they said not too long ago, they said, this is so about us, but how does it work in America? And I think that's been universally true. And that's what's going to make that show continue on and on and on. Plus, it's all about those first experiences everyone has in high school.
Oh, yes. It's such a universally joyful show. I was fascinated by what went on during previews. 30% of the show got changed within one day after the first preview. And the impression I got from the cast members was that they believed the show was really in trouble during the previews. Did you think the show was in trouble at that time?
Oh, I think it probably depended on the hour I was living in, because, you're just trying to survive in those situations. You're just trying to keep it moving forward. And this was my first big New York endeavor. And I was confident that if we kept working and with the collaborative group that surrounded me, that we could make this successful. But at the same time, you are well aware that certain things are not working excruciatingly. And if I can go back a second, because I don't think I answered your question about casting fully. I mean, one of the reasons those auditions were so difficult is because not only did they have to do all the singing and the scenes, but they then were put into a callback for the dance auditions. And most of these people, because as you said, we were not seeking dancers first, these were people that dancing was not the first thing on their resume. So it was not something that came easily or naturally to many of them. And so they were constantly put into different pairings, different groups. I mean, we must have seen more strolls in those auditions because Pat had a wonderful idea that how they behaved in that stroll would indicate how they were going to behave on the floor of the gymnasium for the dance. And of course, it turned out to be absolutely true. So you could see a lot. When you give an actor something that they have to execute, it takes away a lot of those other pressures and simply puts it on the pressure of having to do the stroll, which of course is what we all had to go through when we were in high school. Well, I'm dating myself, of course, but it's hard to have directed Grease and not date yourself. I mean, it was a long time ago.
During previews, you cut a song sung by the Patty character, who was played by Eileen Kristen. What's it like to have to tell a performer that their only song has been cut from the show?
Here's the reality of that. I didn't tell her. I thought she had been told. I thought she knew, but she had not been told. I've never made that mistake again in my career because it was heartbreaking to see her face, because I was reeling off notes after that first preview about this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to proceed today and for the next 3 weeks. And one of the things which was presented almost like a grocery list, and the song Yuck is cut. Well, it was her only song. And to a great extent, probably was one of the reasons she wanted so much to be in the show, was because of this song. But it just wasn't working, so it had to go. So that's how that happened.
There's a very interesting episode you wrote about, Tom, where an investor by the name of Anthony D'Amato attended a production meeting during previews, and he basically tore the show to shreds. He was thrown out of the meeting. My question is this: what is the proper protocol between the production team and the investors?
Well, that is such an interesting question, because in those days, investors were investors. Now they're called producers, even though they don't have anything to do with the actual producing. And I think what that does, it takes away from the gift of a good producer, because Ken Waissman and Maxine Fox were really extraordinary producers in terms of confidence. You asked if I had confidence. To a great extent, they had confidence more than any of us, and it allowed us to just keep moving forward. But the investors, and I think in the book, in that story, it talks about the fact that Ken still to this day does not know why he let him come to that meeting, because that was we had meetings every night, to go over what was working and what wasn't working. And I think he had no idea that was going to happen. It turns out this man who nearly stopped the show cold during that meeting. I mean, I'm not kidding. You could feel the air going out of everyone in the room because we were living on fumes to keep going, no sleep, etc. And he has made more money than anyone on this show of Grease because the show, Kid and Maxine, had to keep doing things in order to provide things we found we needed, like when we made the set better, when we had add certain costumes, all of that sort of thing. And he was the one that put in a lot of that money, but he was never seen again. No one, as far as I know, connected with the show has ever seen him again. But his name is on the original credits as the associate producer because he was a big investor. Now, a big investor in those days, I mean, now it would mean something like if you were a big investor, you'd be investing maybe $4 or $5 million. I think he probably put in $45,000. Something like that. But of course, Grease has paid back well over 500 to 1, and I think it's approaching 700 to 1. So
I guess that financial return helped soothe his ego after being thrown out of the meeting.
Probably, but you wonder about somebody like that has so little awareness of what's going on around him in terms of creativity, that he could do that to people. But as you read in the book, one of the great stories is the fact that the quiet author, who is Warren Casey, who usually would, whatever he had to say would be fairly quietly said and not demanding. And he just exploded. And that's what most of us remember about the meeting, is the fact of him exploding, saying, we have to get back to work to fix this show. And this is ridiculous. And this is going to stop. And he threatened, I think, to throw him out the window, this investor. But I don't think Ken would ever let another investor into a meeting. But again, they're called producers, and I don't think that's right. I don't know who started that, who started calling them producers, because you see resumes all the time, and they say produced show and show. Well, they didn't produce anything. They've simply provided the money.
When Grease opened on February 14th, 1972, you were 27 years old. You'd been out of Yale Drama School for 3.5 years. And there you were, standing at the top of the left center aisle, too nervous to take a seat in the audience. Take us back to that night, Tom, and tell us what was going through your mind.
Well, what was going through my mind that night, we had accomplished miracles in those 3 weeks. I mean, it was truly thrilling. When you go into, we certainly thought when we went into rehearsals that we had everything worked. And we thought all the things that we're going to put into the production. But of course, that's never the case. You find out that what you thought worked is not going to work. But we had, during those 3 weeks, fixed each and every moment that we could, that we were aware of, and the audience had made us aware of. And so I felt really good. And the first act had gone fantastically well. But I always knew that we were in trouble when it came to the second act, because the show takes a very serious turn with the scene about Rizzo's pregnancy and the Burger Palace boys and Pink Ladies finding out about it. And then she sings Worst Things I Can Do. And you've got to make sure that you sail into that without letting the audience know you're shifting gears. And then they roll with it, and then they're into it emotionally. Well, that's where we had gotten to when, as I was standing, you are so specific, you are so prepared, as everyone has said to me, because you know that I was indeed on that left center aisle up at the top. And this woman gets up right before this little scene that leads into Worst Things, staggers up the aisle and falls flat on carpet in front of me. And I don't know how I had the chutzpah at 27 to do it. But when Usher started moving toward her, I said, nobody is touching her until after Worst Things I Can Do. Now, I like to think this is the way it was. I do think I was clear that she had just fainted, that it was not serious because she was not having any kind of medical event, but nevertheless, and maybe she had fallen. But nevertheless, I was quite serious, and I stopped anybody from going there. And indeed, at the end of Worst Things, we got her up. I didn't get her up. I was still watching the show, but the ushers got her up, helped her to the ladies' room. I think she came back for the curtain call and was at the back of the rail right along with me, where I had stood there while she fell to the floor. But I think about that sometimes, and I thought, wow, that was pretty either gutsy, careless, or immoral. I'm not sure which, but it happened. It's very real.
It was very real. It was the exemplification of the show must go on. That's what I thought when I read it.
Well, it was, and fortunately, she was okay. But yeah, I've never forgotten that because there's some stuff in the book right before that. I can't stop pacing when a show of mine's going on. So I had been pacing back and forth, and I'd finally settled in right there at the left center aisle when this happened.
I want to ask you about reviews, Tom. Clive Barnes at the New York Times did not love the show, but Douglas Wyatt at the Daily News and Walter Kerr at the Sunday Times loved it. So, Tom, now that people can post reviews online and the public has so many reviews to choose from, do you think the newspaper reviews are as important today as they used to be?
No, I don't think for a minute they are, because the New York Times could close a show in those days. I mean, the New York Times attacked it big time. I mean, Clive Barnes was in no way enthusiastic, and it was negative, but it was not one of those, this has to be driven off the boards. But if someone did do that, and I know people sometimes say, oh, well, a show will survive anything if it's good. Well, that's just not true. There were several shows back there in the 70s that I had seen that were really, really fantastic. And they were closed because that initial review was so strong and had such influence that people just didn't come. But no, I don't think that has that power at all. Now, it doesn't help. Of course, you want the good review, especially from the Times, because it's the most widely read. And quite frankly, for most creative people, it's the one they want most because it's the New York Times. You know, it's an imprimatur. But I don't think it has nearly the power it used to have. And I think it's probably been diluted in a good way by having their co-chief critics at the Times now. So they're different critics writing, or at least they're co-chief critics for movies. I don't know what, I think they are for theater too. But I think that's good. It's not just one man's vision of what the theater should be. There's been a lot of talk because the Brooks Atkinson Theater is losing its name in order to be changed. And Brooks Atkinson was the dean of theater critics for decades. But he was one of those remarkable critics, from what I can tell, who managed to keep a balance, and he was always supporting the theater, even when he was being negative. He wasn't getting a pleasure out of a witty line that decimated someone. Like John Simon used to write reviews that it sometimes they were fun to read because he could annihilate someone in a very witty way. But of course, he's annihilating a work and a person. And I don't think that happens nearly as much anymore either. So I think the state of criticism is actually good, but I think it's good that it doesn't have that kind of power.
Although Grease got 7 Tony nominations, it didn't win any Tony Awards, which was a big shock. Some people feel that the show was snubbed because technically it was an off-Broadway show at that time. Do you agree that that is the reason it didn't win any Tony Awards?
No, no. I think, first of all, Tony Awards depend a great deal on whether people saw the show. And I'm not sure a lot of people saw our show because they didn't come downtown to do it. I mean, the Tony voters have to see it. And that didn't happen. I think that's probably more to the fact. Ken and Maxine, especially Ken, fought very hard to get us recognized. We were actually on a Broadway contract because even though we were in the off-Broadway area, it was a Broadway-sized house. It was the old Yiddish theater, which at that point was called the Eden. But it was, when we moved uptown, it was just a steady move. And Ken has made a big point then that when we moved uptown, we were just moving theaters. We were not moving to Broadway because he always tried to introduce it to the audience as a Broadway show. But it was a good move, which I doubted at the time. But when it moved uptown, all of a sudden it got the carriage train. And that's when you start to become a really big hit. Because over the summer, we kept growing and we were doing well, but it was not, sometimes a lot of people think Grease began as a phenomenon. It did not in any way begin as a phenomenon. It's the little engine that slowly worked its way up the hill. And then, of course, it exploded with the movie. And then, of course, in history, it's easy to say, oh, well, of course it was a hit. Look at it. Well, it was anything but. So anyway, that's a long answer to that.
On June the 7th, 1972, the show moved to the Broadhurst Theater on Broadway. What did it feel like to have your first Broadway show as a director playing at the same theater where 5 years earlier you sat in the audience watching Half a Sixpence, which was your first Broadway show?
It was magical because I didn't know it until I was in the middle of tech rehearsals. Because, when we're moving uptown, the Broadhurst, it's a stunning theater, but I just thought, oh, isn't this great? We're going to this stunning theater. And I hadn't thought anything about the theater I had seen Half a Sixpence in at that time. But it was in the middle of tech. And I all of a sudden started looking around while I was waiting for a lighting cue to be adjusted. And I went, oh my God, I was up in that balcony. This is where I saw my first Broadway show and got so excited about it. And it almost was, I'm getting a little chill just talking about it because it was almost mystical. So much of my career has been luck. I really believe that. Yes, you have to be prepared, but it's so much as being in the right place at the right time. There are lots of people that are talented and able to do things, but they just don't have those opportunities. And here I was, those short 4 or 5 years later, in that same theater. And I had as I put it in the book, my own song and dance show. And it was thrilling. It was really thrilling. And it was thrilling to be on Broadway. This is not something I had ever even imagined. Not just for Grease, but I had not begun my career thinking, oh, I'm going to be a Broadway director and then I'm going to do television and I'll do some movies. I just was trying to move from whatever worked to the next thing that whatever worked for me. I didn't have any big master plan. But the master plan tended to work out.
It was your destiny, Tom. Now, as we all know, many big stars got their start in Grease, either on Broadway or in the national tours. Adrienne Barbeau, Barry Bostwick, John Travolta, Patrick Swayze, Mary Lou Henner, Richard Gere, Treat Williams, Rex Smith, Alan Paul from the Manhattan Transfer, and so many more. You must be so proud of the success of so many people connected with the show.
I am extremely proud of that. I'm extremely proud of of several things. I'm proud of the instinct that made us find those people, because some would say we certainly gave them their first big break, but several of them had been, hoofing around in the Broadway arena. But we gave them a real showcase, and especially in the role of Danny Zuko and Rizzo in terms of women, Sandy to some extent, but not as much. But the Danny Zuko's, it was legendary because anybody that became a film star pretty much of a certain age at that era had been in Grease. And yeah, I'm very proud of that. But I'm also proud of the fact that everybody has been close from the first moment until now. And one of the things that happened when we had our 50th reunion is just that celebration. Each of these companies, and there are an incredible number of iterations of the Broadway show, because we kept the road companies were road teams for the Broadway company. So eventually most of them ended up on Broadway, but they started as an individual company and they were all extremely close and have stayed extremely close. And then, of course, when they became on Broadway, we're one big Broadway family. And I know that becomes cliche to talk about the closeness of a cast, but everybody was approximately the same age. Everybody was having approximately the beginning of their careers. And so that's a very unusual thing in a show. You usually don't have that. In most Broadway shows, especially musicals, there's a whole gradation of times and eras that are represented. We had one era, which was the 70s. That's what we all came from. And so that's how it happened.
I had to laugh when I read that John Travolta, who wanted to play Danny Zuko in the national tour, was told he was too young, so he was cast as Doody. What was your reaction when you found out that he was cast as Zuko in the movie?
Oh, well, everybody, everybody wants to take credit for these big things that become historic. I am sure I was one of the first people that mentioned to Alan Carr, because he met with me because I knew him because he had once wanted to represent me, and suggested John Travolta. But several people were suggesting John Travolta. Ken Waissman was suggesting John Travolta. First of all, John had grown up. But if you look at it, well, I'm jumping here, but when I flew back to California after all these celebrations in June of our book and the 50th anniversary, I thought, oh, I haven't had enough Grease. I'll watch the movie on the plane again. I haven't seen it since it came out, in 1978 or 77, whatever it was. And I was amazed at how much Doody is in John's Danny, because people that see the movie don't know the character of Doody, but he was this incredibly charming, young, kind of bumbling guy that was becoming part of the gang. And there's an innocence to John's Danny that is immensely appealing. And a lot of that is what was in his Doody. And I found that really interesting. But no, I wasn't surprised at all. As I said once before to a publication, I said there was something about John. I swear he somehow created a vacuum in the universe, and then he stepped in to fill it. His ambition was so intense, and he so had his vision on what he was going to do. The reality is, I don't think we ever considered him at all seriously for Danny. I don't even know that when he came in, we were thinking Danny. He thought that's what he was there for, but we did that a lot. We'd have people come in for a part, and then we'd say, why don't you read this? But that's what he thinks. There's a whole nother version of that story, by the way, that's in the book, that's in another book that I discovered, that John wanted the audition so much, and the casting directors, because I wasn't involved at that point at all, because the casting directors were searching out people for us to see. And that he told the casting directors he would come in and do Xeroxing or whatever else they wanted if they would let him audition. I don't know which is true, but those are his words in this other book. It's one of those Broadway history books. But whatever the case is, John Travolta, of course, became the most famous person connected with our stage show, and not undeservedly.
No, that's for sure. I also learned from the book that Tom Hanks auditioned for the show and didn't get the job. Isn't that amazing?
Well, it's not amazing, because I looked through I don't do this very often, but I looked through our audition list, I don't know, about 7 or 8 years ago. And I was amazed at the number of incredibly successful theater people and stars and film people that we auditioned and didn't cast. Tom was the one that the music director remembered, but there were many of those. So no, it's not amazing. Tom Hanks wasn't Danny Zuko. He's not right for Danny Zuko. He's not right now, and he wasn't right then. Again, it has nothing to do with talent or what a fantastic guy he is. I would have loved to have worked with Tom Hanks. And he's, who doesn't love Tom Hanks? But he wasn't right for that. But there's several others that are worked on Broadway that I know I turned down. And I know to some don't forgive me and always resented it, but they just weren't right for it. They're brilliantly talented, but they weren't right for this.
You described the Broadway cast over the years as an ongoing carousel of talent. Every time a cast member left to go on and become a big star, you had the daunting task of replacing them. That must have been incredibly frustrating and difficult.
I wouldn't say it was frustrating. It's just part of the process. We were lucky in that we often had actors waiting in the wings, so to speak, by being in these road tours. So we often knew exactly who we were going to bring in next. For instance, Jeff Conaway was the first cover in New York for Danny Zuko. And then he led the national tour. And that part of the agreement was that he would come in and take it over at that point, when Barry left. And they actually did it earlier because Jeff came in earlier so Barry could open Los Angeles, because Barry wanted that opportunity. But so that was there. But yes, and sometimes, quite frankly, in replacements, we made mistakes. I don't, I take letting someone go very seriously. I consider it my error, even though it's a collaborative process, if we cast the wrong person. But that happened a couple of times in the replacements, and we ended up not having them there for an enormously long time because they just weren't exactly on the mark and weren't delivering exactly on the mark. But for the most part, I think we did really well. And I give enormous credit to our casting directors who were so helpful. I mean, I wouldn't have known who these people were because they're the ones that go around and see everything that's playing and get these people in for you to see. You can't do that as a director. And I was off doing other projects as well. I mean, there were times I like to think I was always grateful, and I'm pretty sure I was. But there were times I thought, oh my God, I can't sit through another audition of, beauty school dropout. I just can't do it. And of course I could. And now, of course, I'd love to have the opportunity to do it again. Not that I'd like to do another production, but I wish we were still running because that was such a family. I mean, the producers and everybody, we just worked so beautifully together that when it finally did close all those 8 years, I mean, think about it. I mean, both your high school and college years, that's the length of time you spend doing both. And you get to know everybody so well, and you become a smooth running machine. And it was very hard when it closed. It was very hard to let it go.
One of the most fascinating aspects of your book is the comments by the people who were understudies, whom you described as perhaps the most underappreciated members of the cast. They really provided a lot of insight into what it's like to be always the bridesmaid, never the bride, don't they?
Well, yes, and it turns out it was prescient because of COVID. There has been so much now about understudies and covers saving the show. I mean, that they get standing ovations after they appear, and the stars talk about what they did, and the producers talk about we couldn't go on. And it's really interesting that we should, because I became fascinated because when we asked for these stories, we didn't say anything anybody had to produce. We just said, send anything that is a story. It needs to have a beginning, middle, and an end. It needs to hold our interest, but anything you want to write about. And these understudies, one after another, started pouring in about these stories about how painful it was and how they felt sometimes left out, how they felt like a fifth wheel, all of that sort of things. And Joy Rinaldi, who was our original understudy, who at one point was covering all the female roles, talks about the book, and to a certain extent, and these celebrations as having transformed past history, because she finally feels that she was truly one of the gang. And that's a great thing. The great thing about a book for anybody that writes it about the history of a show, the thing that makes this one, I think, unique is the fact there are lots of books about Broadway shows, and some better Broadway shows than we are. But nobody has done this where they literally cover the 8-year history of a show and its initial run and all those road companies and how all of those people were interwoven. And that's what I think makes it unique and special. And one of the things, as you said, that makes it particularly so is that honesty from the understudies of how they felt and what it meant. And I knew intellectually that was true, but I never really had proper empathy for it until I started reading some of these things. And I went, oh my God, this was painful for a lot of people. And yet they continued to do their professional jobs and what had to be done.
Well, one of the understudies by the name of Malcolm Groom wrote that an understudy is like a neighbor, useful in an emergency, but not part of the family. He said it was a challenge to his self-esteem and emotional security. Tom, what advice do you give to understudies?
I think you took the job because you didn't get one of the lead roles. And you didn't get one of those lead roles, not because of your talent, but because you just weren't iconically right for a specific thing that we had to cast. And I think the key is to just know your time is coming. I think that's true for all of us in show business. If you stick it out, I'm fond of talking, I talk to a lot of students, and I'm fond of saying, last man standing. You have no idea what's going to happen to other people in their lives and careers, or to you. I'm the one out of my college theater group least likely to have a big career, least likely. And I ended up, not because of talent, all of them were talented, but just because of either sticking it out or being at the right place at the right time. So I think understudies just have to grit and bear it. And eventually, a lot of those understudies, of course, went on to play iconic roles in the show.
I want to ask you about your directing style, Tom. Your reputation as a director is that you're a collaborator, not a dictator. And for Grease, you encouraged the actors to inject some of their own personalities into their acting, especially for the actors playing Danny Zuko in the drive-in movie scene. What gave you the idea to do that?
Well, if you read any books by directors, most directors grow into that. I think we all, because we're so insecure, or at least a lot of us, I was that way. I was a lot more rigid when I began, in that I didn't trust that. I trusted them, but I didn't trust myself. So I wanted to make sure I had it totally ready to go. So I would work out everything in my head. Now, I think you still have to do that to a certain extent, but then you have to let that go. And when you're in rehearsal, you just have to let it happen. And when I would let it happen, magic would happen that I couldn't imagine, because what the director can imagine is never as exciting as what happens when the actor takes it to a whole new place. And I learned that in time. I don't know that I did that. Well, I probably learned that to a great extent over those 8 years. I was probably a lot freer with the last tour than I was with the original. But to a certain extent, that was helped by working with Pat Birch, who was an amazing collaborator. And we had such an easy give and take. And also, Grease was so freewheeling. They weren't perfect scenes. A lot of musicals, they're really, the scenes are kind of perfect. They've got, a total shape and a total climax and all that. That wasn't necessarily the case in Grease. They were more slices of life. And so to a certain extent, you have to be freewheeling, because the actors are going to bring things. Also, I didn't really know much about greasers. So what the actors brought to it helped me to find what I thought we could present on the stage, as a contrast to the toughness that perhaps was originally written into these characters and what was palatable for a New York Broadway audience.
Adrienne Barbeau wrote that when she was having difficulty getting into her character, Rizzo, you told her to try laughing at herself after delivering a line, and it worked. Where did you get that idea from?
From her. Because half of the time what you do as a director is if you observe, and backtrack a little bit, but one of the things that I was able to do because of Pat doing all those dance auditions, I was able to observe actors without having to be in the mix. I would just watch them as they were dealing with how was their attitude, how did they function, what was their sense of humor. And I saw Adrienne, and the more I got to know her, she has a marvelous sense of humor about herself, in that she never takes herself too seriously. And for some reason, well, I think for obvious reasons, maybe, Rizzo, who's such a tough chick, she was zeroing in on that and leaving out the fact that Rizzo could very much be a person like Adrienne. I'm not saying people need to copy their own behavior, but in this case, it was a marvelous way to undercut some of the harshness of the character. Because just the lines themselves, they're tough. They're not pleasant. They're not fun. But when you know she's doing it with a sense of, I know who I am, or I'm learning who I am, and I know that I'm not perfect either, but this is ridiculous. And it worked for her. There's another actress that in another article somewhere felt that I told her to do the same thing, and she felt that we were trying to impose Adrienne's performance on her. It's not true. I just think that would have helped her as well. And eventually it did, but she found it herself. because that's what she does. She does laugh at the end of lines.
Peggy Lee Brennan wrote that as a director, you only come down hard on those you believe in. Is that true?
Well, the way it's quoted in the book, I say that. I say that to her. I had, when you're giving note sessions, and this is being very honest, but when you're giving note sessions, especially to a group that you like and everybody likes, and I mean, I loved all those people. And you sometimes start performing, quite frankly, as a director. You're on a roll. So you start making people laugh, etc. And I had come down, I had come down on Peggy very hard because of some improvements, quote, that she had put into the production since I'd seen it last. And they had to be stopped. But I could have done it in a more gentle way. But I was on a roll. I'd been doing a number of other notes. And so I started making fun of the prima donna that Peggy Lee Brennan was becoming with Frenchie. And I didn't realize it at the time because I wasn't looking directly at her, but she had started to cry. And I realized at the end of it that that's what had happened. And that's how that conversation occurred, because everybody had left and I asked her to please stay behind and I talked to her. She's actually been in several things. I adore Peggy Lee. She's truly still in an advanced age, a total innocent. She actually, when she read the book, she said, "Tom, there are a couple of risque things in there." And I said, "Yes, Peggy, there are," because that's just who she is. But anyway, that's how that happened. So I'm pleased with how I ended that meeting. I'm not pleased with how I began it. If I could do it again, I wouldn't. But again, we tried in the book, and I tried, I would be the first one to see them. And there were certainly ways for me to throw things out if they were negative to me, but I didn't, because I thought those were important. It's like Eileen Christen's, which you referred to, who was the original Patty, and not telling her about Yuck. I don't think I realized even until that point that I hadn't told her. So I thought it was important that be in there, just like Peggy and just like other people when they get hurt by it. You can have your power as a director is sometimes immense, and it sometimes goes awry in ways you have no intention of it happening. It's small moments, but you'd like to think it's small moments, maybe it's big moments, but I try to correct those as quickly as I can.
Tom, can you take us back to that night at Sardi's when Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor invited you and the cast to have dinner with them?
Well, I felt like an interloper because it was the cast they had fallen in love with. They didn't know me at all. So to a certain extent, I was just tagging on. But Richard Burton, who was doing Equus next door, he had taken over for Anthony Hopkins at the Plymouth Theater. And he used to, when he wasn't on, he would sometimes come over and catch a scene of Grease. And he fell in love with the joy and innocence of the show. And he had gotten very fond of them. And so he went backstage and everybody was terribly excited. And that's in the book. And then he invited everybody to Sardi's. But it's one of those heady moments that you can't really believe were real, because of course they were the biggest stars in the world at that time. And there we were at two tables surrounding them and listening to everything they had to say and observing the behavior. And it was delicious. There's so many things like that in Grease and so many other things in my career that I'm just so grateful for, because they were just moments that you never expected to happen to you. And there you are. And it's historic, so it's fun.
I want to take you back to another big night, Tom, December the 8th, 1979, when Grease played its 3,243rd performance, making it at the time the longest running Broadway show, breaking the record set by Fiddler on the Roof. Many original Grease alumni were present, and some of them even performed on stage. What a thrilling night that must have been for you, Tom.
There's no way to say how thrilling that was. That's one of the 2 or 3 greatest nights of my life without question, because one, just the fact that this little engine that could had achieved this kind of prominence, and we were actually surpassing Fiddler. A lot of people were upset we were surpassing Fiddler because Fiddler is one of the great classic musicals, and Grease is still considered an outlier. But nevertheless, we were doing it. And Ken and Maxine had arranged for it to be done really well. So what we did was the original company, start with the First National. The First National Company played the first act, the original First National Company, and the original Broadway company played the second act. And then in the audience, along with all sorts of other luminaries, were the alumni, who were then called up, much like a graduation to pomp and circumstance, up onto the stage. So if you see that picture, which is in the book, they're packed all over the stage. I mean, packed. They're in every corner of the stage, Grease alumni. And to know that I had been certainly at the center of helping to pull all these people together was thrilling beyond measure. And I've never forgotten the feeling. I've never forgotten any of it. It was just something. And it wasn't that long after that we closed. That's the irony. It was less than a year later that we closed for various reasons. But anyway, it's incredibly memorable.
Now, Tom, as you know, Grease has had an 8-year run on Broadway, 3 national tours, 3 bus and truck tours, 2 summer stock shows on the East Coast, a residency in Florida, 2 productions in London's West End, and of course, the show is still performed at thousands of high schools all over the world. You were quoted by Jeremy Stone as saying that Grease is like a weed. It grows anywhere. What do you think accounts for the show's enduring appeal?
Well, to me, it is indeed those characters that everybody identifies with. I don't think there's a human being that's certainly American, but it seems to be universal across the world, that doesn't have a character they think is close to them. That's the first thing. Second thing is, especially in America, that those first experiences that you have in high school, I think, are life formative. I'm a firm believer, and I say this all the time, that whoever you are, to a great extent, is built on who you were or were not in high school. Oh. It's so built into the American progress that what you go through there will determine. So sometimes if you were a hero there, you might not be later. If you weren't a hero there, you have to be later. And I just believe that all comes out to that. So I think that what people respond to, it has an innocence and a joy that I think is irresistible, much like the 50s music.
I love what Barry Bostwick said. He said that every teenage boy wants to be a rock and roll star, and every clean-cut teenage girl wants to be a slut, if only for a couple of hours on stage. Therein lies the appeal of Grease. But for me, Tom, it's all about the music, don't you think?
Well, I think huge amounts are about the music. I mean, with any musical, it's the music that counts. I mean, your job as a director, and when we did all that work to cut down the scenes, because they had been, before we got to New York and while we were auditioning, the authors and I were working on it at night, was to get those scenes down to their basic essence so that it could sail into a musical number. And yes, I think it's all about the music. And I still listen to 50s music sometimes when I just need a high, because it's so innocent. I mean, the 50s weren't innocent. There was all sorts of darkness going on, but we perceived it. And certainly when we were in high school in that era, we perceived it as innocence. And you listen to that music and it's just, the simplicity of it is irresistible. And yes, I think that's a great deal of its success. And I think Warren and Jim were incredibly clever in terms of coming up with these songs that could have very much been 50s hit tunes. And they still are. I mean, it's amazing.
Would you have liked to have directed the movie?
Yes and no. Yes, I would have liked the opportunity to direct a first movie, because that would have been my first movie. I did some after, but that would have been the first. But no, I'm not, because I don't think it would have been successful. Because I think I would have tried to make it too much like the Broadway musical. And one of the genius things, I think, that's not a movie about the 50s. It's a movie about the 50s as seen through the eye of the 70s. There's as much 70s in the Grease movie as there is 50s. And I think that's why it was so successful. I really do. I mean, yes, all the things that made the show a success. And of course, Pat Birch did the choreography. I think Randall did a nice job, Randall Kleiser, who directed it. But I think it was Alan Carr's idea that that's what he was going to do. And that's what he did. And I think it's what made it successful. But I'm not sure I would have gone along with that. And I think that could have hurt it. It's interesting. I've never felt any resentment about the movie. People ask me about that. And I said, I was lucky in that when it first was made, first of all, I was seeing Pat Birch quite often because she was out here filming. And so we were socializing all the time. So I'd know what was going on, but I never felt any kind of, oh gosh, I wish I was doing that at all. And when I saw it, a friend of mine who was a producer, Larry Mark, arranged a private screening at the Paramount Building in New York. But I saw the movie all by myself, so I could just grasp it before people would ask me, what'd you think? And I had a good time. I just had a good time. I thought much of it was clever. I obviously wouldn't have done some of the things they did, but I thought it was clever and witty. And I thought some of the casting was fantastic. I thought the leads were, of course, fantastic. I think some things could have been more specific. The men, I think, in particular, became more generic than they ever were in the show. John was fantastic, and Olivia was fantastic.
Well, Tom, I must tell you, I've so enjoyed this opportunity to talk with you about Grease and about your wonderful book. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Oh, I'm just delighted. And, I had heard before how well you were prepared. And, it turns out to be true. There were marvelously specific questions that led me to probably rambling answers, but I at least knew what I was supposed to be answering. So I thank you for that.
Well, it was my great pleasure. I'm glad you found me well prepared because it was a thrill. The book was such a joy to read. It didn't feel like work at all. So thank you.
You're more than welcome. And I do think people will enjoy it if they read it. And you don't have to be Grease fans. It just is. It's about growing up, really. That's really what it's about.
Our guest has been the highly acclaimed director, Tom.Moore. His book, Grease, Tell Me More, is available wherever books are sold. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you to my team in LA and in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.